The fluorescent lights of Riverside Maximum Security Prison hummed their constant, soul-crushing tune as three women sat in cells barely 6 feet apart, each counting down to the same inevitable end. They had never spoken to each other, had never even made eye contact, but they shared something more intimate than friendship. They shared a death sentence. What none of them knew was that their salvation would come from the most unlikely source, a man who had spent his entire life being invisible, whose gentle heart had been forged in the furnace of his own impossible circumstances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first snow of December fell like ash across the industrial skyline of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, coating the razor wire and concrete walls of Riverside Maximum Security Prison in a deceptive blanket of purity. Inside, the death row wing maintained its perpetual climate of despair, a place where time moved differently, sometimes crawling with the weight of endless waiting, sometimes racing toward dates marked in red on calendars that no one wanted to see. Cell Block D housed exactly 11 condemned prisoners, but only 3 of them were women. In a system designed by men for men, these 3 occupied a special kind of hell, isolated not just from the world outside, but from each other by invisible barriers of shame, grief, and the peculiar psychology of the damned. Sarah Michelle Rodriguez sat on the edge of her narrow cot, her dark hair hanging like curtains around a face that had once been featured on magazine covers. At 28, she retained traces of the beauty that had made her a rising star in Hollywood's constellation of hopefuls, but prison had carved new lines around her eyes and added a gauntness to her cheeks that no makeup could conceal. The canto orange jumpsuit hung loose on her diminished frame, a uniform that had become her second skin over the past 3 years. Her crime had made international headlines: the murder of famous director Marcus Huntington during what prosecutors called a drug-fueled rage at his Beverly Hills mansion. The tabloids had painted her as a manipulative actress who killed her mentor when he threatened to expose her cocaine addiction and end her career. The jury had seen through her tears, her lawyer's arguments about self-defense falling apart under the weight of forensic evidence and witness testimony that seemed ironclad. But sitting in her cell, Sarah knew a truth that no courtroom had heard. Huntington hadn't been her mentor, he had been her predator. For 2 years, he had used his power to manipulate and abuse her, threatening to destroy her career if she spoke out, promising stardom if she remained silent. The night she killed him, she hadn't been high on cocaine. She had been fighting for her life against a man who had finally decided that owning her wasn't enough, wanted to break her completely. The evidence that could have saved her had disappeared from police files. Witnesses who could have testified to Huntington's pattern of abuse had suddenly become unavailable or changed their stories. Money had a way of reshaping truth in Hollywood, and Marcus Huntington had possessed enough of it to buy justice even. From beyond the grave, 3 cells down, Elena Catherine Brooks pressed her forehead against the cold metal bars, watching the snow fall through the single window that provided their block's only view of the outside world. At 35, she looked older, her red hair streaked with premature gray and her green eyes, carrying the weight of losses that extended far beyond her own impending execution. Elena had been a nurse at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, specializing in pediatric oncology, a job that had required her to witness suffering that would have broken most people. She had found purpose in comforting dying children, in being present for families facing the unimaginable loss of a child. Her colleagues had described her as an angel, someone who could calm the most frightened patients with nothing more than a gentle touch and a few soft words. The irony of her situation was so bitter, it tasted like poison in her mouth. She had been convicted of murdering 3 children in her care, accused of injecting them with lethal doses of insulin during what prosecutors claimed were mercy killings motivated by a God complex. The evidence against her had seemed overwhelming. Security footage showing her entering the victim's rooms, medical records documenting the unexplained insulin levels, and testimony from hospital staff about her unusual behavior in the weeks before the deaths. What the prosecution hadn't revealed, what Elena's overworked public defender had failed to discover, was that the hospital's chief administrator had been covering up a contaminated insulin supply that had already killed 2 children in other wards. When Elena began asking questions, when she started documenting the pattern of unexplained deaths, she became a liability that needed to be eliminated. The contaminated insulin had been replaced, the records altered, and Elena had been framed with surgical precision by people who had millions of dollars in liability to hide. She had tried to tell her story during the trial, but it sounded like the desperate invention of a woman facing the electric chair. Without evidence, without witnesses, without the resources to conduct an independent investigation, her claims of conspiracy had only made her seem more delusional, more dangerous. In the middle cell, between Sarah and Elena, sat the youngest of the 3 condemned women. Jasmine Ann Williams was only 24, though the haunted expression in her brown eyes belonged to someone who had seen decades more of the world's cruelty. Her black hair was woven into intricate braids that she maintained with obsessive care, the only form of self-expression still available to her in this place where identity was supposed to be erased. Jasmine's story was perhaps the most tragic of the 3 because it involved the murder of her own infant daughter, 6-month-old Destiny Williams. The prosecution had painted her as a monster, a young mother who had shaken her baby to death in a fit of rage brought on by postpartum depression and drug addiction. The medical examiner had testified about shaken baby syndrome, about the specific pattern of injuries that could only result from violent abuse. The reality was more complex and infinitely more heartbreaking. Jasmine had been trapped in an abusive relationship with Destiny's father, Marcus Thompson, a drug dealer who controlled every aspect of her life through a combination of violence, financial dependence, and psychological manipulation. On the night Destiny died, Marcus had been high on methamphetamine and PCP, convinced that the baby was somehow plotting against him. Jasmine had tried to protect her daughter, had thrown herself between Marcus and the infant, but she hadn't been strong enough to stop what happened next. When the police arrived, called by neighbors who had heard the screaming, they found Jasmine holding her dead daughter and Marcus passed out on the couch. But Marcus had connections, money from his drug operations, and a lawyer who specialized in making problems disappear. Within hours, the narrative had been rewritten. The drugs found at the scene became Jasmine's drugs. The pattern of abuse documented in hospital records became evidence of her instability rather than her victimization. Marcus's injuries from the fight became defensive wounds he had sustained trying to protect the baby from its deranged mother. Jasmine had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder on the advice of a court-appointed attorney who had spent exactly 47 minutes reviewing her case. She had been told that cooperation would result in a life sentence instead of death, but the judge had other ideas. In a decision that shocked even seasoned court observers, Jasmine had been sentenced to death for the murder of her own child, becoming the youngest woman on death row in Pennsylvania's history. Now, 3 years later, all 3 women existed in a kind of suspended animation, caught between a past that had destroyed them and a future that promised only extinction. They had learned to live with the constant background noise of the prison, the clanging of metal doors, the shouting of guards, the occasional screams of inmates losing their grip on sanity. They had adapted to the rhythm of institutional life, where every moment was scheduled, every movement monitored, every human interaction filtered through layers of security, protocol. But what they hadn't learned to live with was the isolation from each other. Prison rules prohibited death row inmates from congregating, from forming the kind of relationships that might provide comfort or hope. They could see each other during the brief periods when their cell doors were open for meals or exercise. But conversation was forbidden, eye contact discouraged, any sign of connection between them immediately punished by solitary confinement. The guards who supervised them were a mixture of professional indifference and barely concealed hostility. Most had been trained to view death row inmates as already dead, as non-persons whose only remaining function was to serve as cautionary tales for the living. The women were fed, cleaned, and maintained like expensive machinery awaiting disposal, but they were not treated as human beings deserving of dignity or compassion. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the prison's chief psychologist, made weekly visits to assess their mental fitness for execution, a process that required them to be sane enough to understand why they were being killed. It was a grotesque bureaucratic requirement that added another layer of cruelty to their situation. If they showed signs of mental breakdown, they would be medicated and treated until they were stable enough to be legally murdered. During these sessions, each woman had learned to perform sanity like actresses playing roles written by their captors. They answered questions with appropriate responses, demonstrated understanding of their situations, and carefully concealed the rage, despair, and growing madness that gnawed at them during the endless hours between meaningful human contact. Sarah had developed an elaborate internal fantasy life where she was still an actress, still performing, still capable of choosing the roles she played. She would spend hours in her cell rehearsing imaginary scenes, perfecting monologues that no audience would ever hear, maintaining the illusion that she was still someone whose story mattered. Elena channeled her nursing instincts into caring for a small spider that had taken up residence in the corner of her cell. She named it Hope and created elaborate scenarios where she was providing medical care to its imaginary injuries. The spider became her patient, her companion, her reason for maintaining the gentle competence that had once defined her professional identity. Jasmine found solace in mathematics, working complex equations in her head and scratching calculations into the paint of her cell walls with her fingernails. Numbers didn't lie, didn't manipulate, didn't pretend to love you while planning your destruction. In the pure logic of mathematical relationships, she found a kind of peace that the world outside had never offered her. None of them knew that their delicate psychological balance was about to be disrupted by the arrival of someone who would change everything, not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through the simple radical act of seeing them as human beings worth saving. The man who would become their salvation was, at that moment, driving through the same December snow that fell on their prison, completely unaware that his own life was about to intersect with theirs in ways that would transform all of them. He was thinking about loss, about failure, about the weight of promises broken and dreams abandoned. He had no idea that he was about to become the most important person in the lives of 3 women who had given up hope of being important to anyone ever again. In the cold fluorescent twilight of cell block D, Sarah, Elena, and Jasmine settled into another night of counting hours until morning, unaware that their countdown to death was about to become a countdown to rebirth. Guided by gentle hands they had never imagined could exist in a world that had shown them only cruelty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 20 miles east of Riverside Maximum Security Prison, in the small industrial town of Oakwood Falls, David Michael Harrison was preparing for what he believed would be his final Christmas. At 42 years old and standing 6 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to block doorways and hands that could palm a basketball like most men held oranges, David had spent his entire adult life being mistaken for someone threatening. Children crossed streets to avoid him. Women clutched their purses tighter when he walked behind them. Store clerks followed him through aisles, waiting for trouble that never came. The irony wasn't lost on David that his imposing physical presence concealed the gentlest soul in 3 counties. where others saw a potential threat. Those who truly knew him saw a man who couldn't bring himself to kill a spider, who cried during commercials featuring rescued animals, and who had dedicated the last 15 years of his life to a profession that existed solely to help others heal. David was a trauma counselor, specializing in helping victims of violent crime rebuild their lives. His practice, housed in a converted Victorian home on Oakwood Falls' quiet Main Street, had become a sanctuary for people whom the justice system had failed to protect or properly serve. His clients included rape survivors whose attackers had walked free on technicalities, parents whose children had been murdered by repeat offenders, and families torn apart by domestic violence that the courts had somehow deemed insufficient for protective orders. What made David uniquely effective in his work wasn't his advanced degrees in psychology and social work, though he possessed both. It wasn't his innovative therapeutic techniques, though he had developed several that were now taught in graduate programs across the country. What made David irreplaceable to his clients was his own intimate understanding of injustice, his personal knowledge of what it felt like to be failed by every system designed to protect the innocent. 25 years earlier, when David was 17 and still growing into his eventual enormous frame, his younger sister Emma had been murdered by her ex-boyfriend, a college student named Bradley Morrison, whose wealthy parents had connections throughout the state's political and judicial networks. Emma had been 16, a high school honor student with dreams of becoming a veterinarian, when Bradley decided that if he couldn't possess her completely, no one could. The murder had been brutal and premeditated. Bradley had stalked Emma for weeks after she ended their relationship, had threatened her in front of witnesses, had even been arrested once for breaking into the Harrison family home. But charges were mysteriously dropped, restraining orders went unenforced, and Emma's increasingly desperate pleas for protection were dismissed by authorities, who saw teenage relationship drama rather than escalating danger. When Emma's body was found in Bradley's apartment, bearing evidence of torture that suggested she had been held captive for days before her death, the Harrison family believed that justice would finally be served. Bradley was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, and held without bail while media attention focused on what seemed like an open and shut case. But Bradley's father was a federal judge, his mother a prominent attorney, and their network of influence extended through every level of Pennsylvania's legal system. Within weeks, key evidence began disappearing from police custody. Witnesses developed sudden memory problems or moved out of state. The medical examiner who had documented Emma's torture was transferred to another jurisdiction before the trial began. By the time the case reached court, the prosecution's position had been so thoroughly undermined that Bradley's defense team was able to argue that Emma's death was the result of accidental asphyxiation during consensual sexual activity. The jury, presented with a narrative that painted Emma as a troubled teenager with a history of risky behavior, deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of voluntary manslaughter. Bradley Morrison served 18 months in a minimum security facility that resembled a country club more than a prison. He was released early for good behavior and went on to complete his law degree, eventually joining his mother's prestigious firm in Philadelphia. Emma Harrison remained dead at 16, her dreams buried with her in Oakwood Falls Cemetery, her family destroyed by a justice system that had valued wealth and connections over truth and accountability. David had channeled his grief and rage into a determination to help others navigate the same broken system that had failed his sister. He earned his degrees while working construction to pay for school, his massive frame making him invaluable on job sites where physical strength mattered more than social grace. But his real education came from the victims he began counseling. During his graduate internships, people whose stories of systemic failure echoed his own family's tragedy in countless variations. Over the years, David had helped hundreds of clients find ways to rebuild their lives after the justice system had failed them. He had learned to work within the system's limitations while finding creative ways around its failures. He had connections throughout Pennsylvania's network of social services, law enforcement, and legal advocacy organizations. Most importantly, he had developed an intuitive understanding of how to help broken people discover that they were stronger than their trauma. But now, sitting in his office as snow continued to fall outside, David was facing his own ultimate test. 3 weeks earlier, his doctor had delivered news that changed everything. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, with a prognosis measured in months rather than years. The same disease that had killed his father was now growing inside David's massive frame, invisible but inexorable, counting down toward an ending he couldn't fight with his strength or intellect. David hadn't told any of his clients about his diagnosis. He had simply begun the process of transferring their cases to other counselors, creating detailed files that would help his colleagues continue the work he was being forced to abandon. It was characteristic of David that even facing his own mortality, his primary concern was ensuring that vulnerable people wouldn't be left without support. As he reviewed the files that represented 15 years of his professional life, David found himself thinking about legacy, about the meaning of a life that would end with so much work left undone. He had helped many people, but for every success story, there were dozens of others he had been unable to reach, victims lost in the system's cracks, cases too complex or dangerous for his limited resources to address. That evening, as David was preparing to lock up his office for the night, he received an unexpected phone call that would change the trajectory of his remaining time on Earth. The caller was Margaret Foster, a social worker at Riverside Maximum Security Prison, whom David had worked with years earlier on a case involving a guard's family member who had been assaulted. David, Margaret's voice was strained, professional, composure barely masking deep concern. I know this is unusual, but I need your help with something that's outside normal channels. Margaret explained that she had been assigned to conduct social assessments of the 3 women on death row as part of their pre-execution protocols. What she had discovered during her interviews had kept her awake for nights, wrestling with information that she was legally obligated to keep confidential but morally compelled to share with someone who might be able to help. These women, Margaret said carefully, their cases all have irregularities that suggest serious miscarriages of justice. But their appeals have been exhausted, their execution dates are approaching, and there's no legal mechanism left to help them. David listened as Margaret outlined what she had learned: evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, witnesses who had been intimidated or bought off, defense attorneys who had been compromised or incompetent. Each case represented a different type of systemic failure, but together they painted a picture of a justice system that had been corrupted beyond recognition. "What are you asking me to do?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I can't officially ask you to do anything," Margaret replied. "But these women are going to die for crimes they either didn't commit or committed under circumstances that should have resulted in very different verdicts. They've been forgotten by everyone who has the power to help them." Margaret paused, and David could hear the weight of her next words before she spoke them. "You've spent your career helping victims of injustice. These women are victims too, even though the system has labeled them perpetrators. They're going to die alone, believing that no one cares about their stories or sees them as human beings worth saving." After Margaret hung up, David sat in his darkened office for hours, staring out at the snow-covered street where normal people were going about their normal lives, unaware that 3 innocent women were counting down their final weeks in cells. Designed to strip away every trace of their humanity, David understood that Margaret was asking him to do something that went far beyond his professional responsibilities. She was asking him to find a way to help people whom the entire legal system had declared beyond help. She was asking him to perform miracles during the final months of his own life, to somehow find justice for people whom justice had abandoned. But as David thought about Emma, about all the victims he had counseled over the years, about the legacy He wanted to leave behind. He realized that Margaret's call wasn't really a request for help. It was an offer of purpose, a chance to use his remaining time in service of something larger than his own tragedy. The next morning, David began making the arrangements that would allow him to gain access to Riverside Maximum Security Prison. He contacted lawyers he had worked with, pulled strings with social service administrators, and leveraged every professional relationship he had built over 15 years of advocacy work. Within a week, he had obtained permission to conduct spiritual counseling sessions with the 3 condemned women, a bureaucratic loophole that would allow him to spend time with them under the guise of providing end-of-life religious support. David didn't consider himself a religious man in any conventional sense, but he understood that what Sarah Rodriguez, Elena Brooks, and Jasmine Williams needed wasn't salvation in the next world. It was recognition of their humanity in this one. They needed someone to see them as more than the crimes they had been convicted of. Someone to acknowledge that their lives had value beyond the legal system's determination that they should be extinguished. As David prepared for his first visit to Riverside Maximum Security Prison, he had no concrete plan for how he might help the 3 women. He possessed no legal authority, no political connections powerful enough to challenge their convictions, no resources that could fund new investigations or appeals. What he had was something much simpler and potentially more powerful: the ability to listen without judgment, to see truth beneath surface narratives, and to refuse to accept that anyone was beyond redemption. He also had something else that he hadn't yet fully acknowledged: nothing left to lose. A man facing his own death in a matter of months was free to take risks that others couldn't afford, to challenge systems that might retaliate against someone with a longer future to protect. David's cancer diagnosis, devastating as it was, had also liberated him from the caution that constrained most advocates working within the system. On the morning of his first visit to death row, David looked at himself in the mirror and saw not the intimidating giant that others perceived, but a man who had finally found a purpose worthy of whatever time remained to him. He was about to enter a place where hope went to die, carrying nothing but his own broken history and an unshakable belief that every human being deserved a chance at redemption. The 3 women waiting in their cells had no idea that their lives were about to intersect with someone who understood their particular form of suffering, someone who had spent decades learning how to help the forgotten and abandoned find their way back to humanity. They were about to meet a man whose gentle heart had been forged in the same fires of injustice that had consumed their own lives, and who was prepared to use his final months on Earth to give them something no one else had offered: a second chance at life itself. The security protocols at Riverside Maximum Security Prison were designed to dehumanize everyone who passed through them, visitors included. David Harrison submitted to the invasive search procedures with the patience of someone who understood that dignity was a luxury in places where power ruled absolutely. Metal detectors, chemical swabs, background verification checks, and finally, the slow procession through 7 different locked gates, each one sealing behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. Warden Patricia Hawkins met David personally, a courtesy that reflected both his professional credentials and the unusual nature of his visit. Hawkins was a career corrections officer who had climbed the ranks through competence rather than politics, a rarity in a system where administrative positions were often filled through patronage rather than merit. She was a small woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and redemption. "Mr. Harrison," she said, as they walked through corridors that echoed with the sound of their footsteps, "I want to be clear about the parameters of your visits. These women are scheduled for execution within the next 6 months. Our primary obligation is to maintain security and ensure that legal protocols are followed precisely." David nodded, understanding the subtext. Hawkins was warning him that any attempt to interfere with the execution process would be viewed as a serious breach of regulations. But there was something in her tone, A carefully controlled neutrality that suggested she had her own questions about the cases under her supervision. "I understand completely," David replied. "I'm here only to provide spiritual comfort during their final weeks, nothing more." The lie came easily because it served a necessary purpose. David had no intention of limiting himself to spiritual platitudes. But he also understood that direct challenges to the prison's authority would result in his immediate expulsion from the facility. He would have to work within the system's constraints while finding ways to accomplish goals that the system was designed to prevent. Cell block D felt different from the rest of the prison, quieter, more oppressive, charged with the particular tension that surrounded people awaiting state-sanctioned death. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher here, the metal doors more solid, the very air heavier with the weight of terminal despair. David's massive frame felt cramped in corridors designed for average-sized people, but he had learned long ago to make himself smaller in confined spaces, to move with deliberate care that wouldn't trigger claustrophobic responses in those around him. The first woman he was scheduled to meet was Sarah Rodriguez, and David spent several minutes outside her cell, simply observing before making his presence known. She sat on her narrow cot with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, staring at a point on the opposite wall with the focused concentration of someone performing an invisible scene. Even in the shapeless orange jumpsuit, there remained traces of the poise that had once made her camera-ready, but prison had carved away. The softness that youth had provided. "Ms. Rodriguez," David said softly, not wanting to startle her. "My name is David Harrison. I'm a counselor, and I've been given permission to spend some time with you, if you're interested." Sarah's eyes shifted to him slowly, as if returning from a great distance. When she saw his enormous frame filling the cell doorway, David expected the usual reaction: fear, intimidation, or defensive posturing. Instead, Sarah studied him with the analytical gaze of someone trained to read character in faces and body language. "You're not what I expected," she said after a long moment. "When they said a spiritual counselor was coming, I pictured someone smaller, more traditionally clerical." David smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his intimidating features into something unexpectedly warm. "I get that reaction a lot. May I sit down?" The plastic chair provided for visitors was comically inadequate for David's size, but he folded himself into it with practiced grace. Sarah watched this process with what might have been amusement, the first positive emotion David had seen. Her display, "So what's your story?" Sarah asked with the directness of someone who had stopped caring about social niceties. "Are you here to save my soul before the state kills my body? Because I should warn you, I've pretty much given up on the concept of divine justice." David considered his response carefully. The truth would either establish trust or end the conversation immediately, but half-truths would be worse than useless. With someone as perceptive as Sarah clearly was. "I'm here because a social worker named Margaret Foster thinks you might be innocent," David said simply. "And because I've spent my career working with people who've been failed by the justice system." The change in Sarah's expression was immediate and profound. The careful mask of indifference fell away, replaced by a mixture of hope and suspicion that spoke to years of disappointment. She leaned forward slightly, studying David's face as if trying to determine whether his words represented genuine possibility or cruel manipulation. "Margaret Foster," Sarah repeated slowly. "She interviewed me last month. Asked a lot of questions about my relationship with Marcus Huntington, about things that never came up during the trial." "What kind of things?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and David could see her wrestling with the decision to trust him. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets that had been buried for years. Things about Marcus that would have changed everything if they'd been allowed in court. About other women he'd hurt, about the system he had in place to silence anyone who tried to speak out against him. About evidence that disappeared before my trial began. Over the next hour, Sarah told David a story that was far more complex than the tabloid narrative that had dominated her case. She described a Hollywood power structure that protected predators through a combination of legal intimidation, financial pressure, and outright threats. She detailed Marcus Huntington's pattern of targeting young actresses, isolating them from support systems, and using his industry connections to destroy anyone who refused his advances or threatened to expose his behavior. The night he died, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "He told me he was tired of playing games. He said he owned me completely, and it was time I understood what that meant. He had pictures, videos, things he'd recorded without my knowledge. He said if I ever tried to leave him or tell anyone about our relationship, he'd release everything and make sure I never worked again." David listened without interruption, his training allowing him to process both the content of Sarah's words and the emotional subtext beneath them. He recognized the psychological patterns of abuse, the way trauma could make victims complicit in their own destruction, the particular cruelty of systems that blamed the vulnerable for their victimization. But that night was different, Sarah continued. He'd been drinking, taking pills. He was more violent than usual, more explicit about what he intended to do. When I realized he meant to. She stopped, unable to voice the details, but David understood. "You fought back." "I fought for my life." The prosecutor made it sound like I'd planned everything, like I was some kind of calculating killer. But the truth is, I barely remember most of what happened. I just remember being terrified, and then suddenly he was on the floor, and there was blood everywhere. David asked careful questions about the investigation, about evidence that had been excluded from her trial, about witnesses who had disappeared or changed their testimony. With each answer, the picture became clearer. Sarah Rodriguez had been systematically framed by people with the resources and connections to manipulate every aspect of the legal process. When their first session ended, David felt the familiar mixture of rage and determination that had driven his career in victim advocacy. But this case was different from the clients he had helped before. Sarah wasn't just a victim of individual criminals. She was a victim of institutional corruption on a scale that made individual justice nearly impossible. His second meeting was with Alina Brooks, and David found her to be a study in controlled devastation. Where Sarah had been animated by anger and residual hope, Alina seemed to have retreated into a kind of professional detachment that reminded David of medical personnel he had known who dealt with trauma by compartmentalizing their emotions. "I've been expecting someone like you," Alina said when David introduced himself. A social worker came by asking questions about hospital protocols, about administrative decisions that didn't make sense. I assumed someone was finally paying attention. Elena's story unfolded with the clinical precision of someone trained to document medical procedures. She described the pattern of unexplained deaths that had begun appearing in the pediatric ward, the way certain administrative personnel had discouraged questions about commonalities between the cases, the sudden policy changes that had made it difficult to track pharmaceutical supplies and patient outcomes. "I started keeping my own records," Alina explained, pulling a small notebook from beneath her mattress contraband that could have resulted in solitary confinement if discovered by guards. "I documented every death, every medication discrepancy, every administrative meeting where concerns were dismissed without investigation." The notebook contained meticulous entries dating back 18 months before Elena's arrest. David recognized the work of someone with both medical training and investigative instincts, someone who had understood that she was documenting a cover-up even before she became its primary target. "What happened when you tried to present this evidence?" Elena's laugh was bitter. "My public defender spent 15 minutes reviewing it and told me it would make me look obsessed, paranoid. He said conspiracy theories would only make the jury think I was delusional enough to kill children. He advised me to focus on character witnesses and hope for mercy." The pattern was becoming familiar to David. competent people discovering serious institutional failures, attempting to address those failures through proper channels, and then being eliminated when they became inconvenient to powerful interests. Alina's case involved millions of dollars in potential liability for a hospital system that had chosen to sacrifice a single nurse, rather than acknowledge systemic problems that could destroy their reputation and financial stability. His third meeting was with Jasmine Williams, and David immediately recognized that she would require a different approach. Where Sarah had been analytical and Elena clinical, Jasmine was emotionally raw, her trauma still fresh despite the years that had passed since her daughter's death. "They told me a counselor was coming," Jasmine said, her voice barely audible. "I thought maybe it was someone who could help me understand why God let this happen to Destiny." David saw immediately that Jasmine's case was different from the others, in crucial ways. While Sarah and Elena had been framed by sophisticated conspiracies involving powerful people, Jasmine had been destroyed by a more common form of institutional failure, the justice system's tendency to blame victims of domestic violence for the crimes committed against them. "Tell me about Marcus Thompson," David said gently, and watched Jasmine's entire body tense at the mention of her abuser's name. The story that emerged was one David had heard variations of countless times in his practice: a young woman trapped in an abusive relationship by a combination of economic dependence, social isolation, and psychological manipulation. Marcus Thompson had been a textbook abuser, escalating from emotional control to physical violence to threats against Jasmine's family members who tried to intervene. "I tried to leave him so many times," Jasmine whispered, tears starting to flow. "But he always found me. He had friends everywhere, in the police, in social services. Every time I reported him, somehow the charges got dropped or the reports got lost. He convinced everyone that I was the problem, that I was unstable, that I made up stories for attention." The night Destiny died, Marcus had been in the grip of a drug-induced psychosis that convinced him his 6-month-old daughter was somehow betraying him. Jasmine had tried to protect the baby, had fought with everything she had, but she had been no match for a man twice her size who was high on methamphetamine and convinced that violence was necessary. When the police came, he was unconscious. "On the couch," Jasmine continued, "I was holding Destiny, trying to see if there was any way to help her, but I knew she was already gone. The officers took one look at the scene and decided I was the killer. Marcus woke up and immediately started telling them how I'd been acting strange, how I'd been violent with the baby." The systematic destruction of Jasmine's case had been swift and thorough. Evidence of Marcus's drug use disappeared from police reports. Witnesses to his pattern of abuse suddenly became unavailable to testify. Medical records documenting Jasmine's own injuries from domestic violence were ruled inadmissible because they were prejudicial to the prosecution's case. "My lawyer told me to plead guilty," Jasmine said. "He said if I cooperated, I'd get life in prison instead of the death penalty. He said a jury would never believe that someone else had killed my baby. But the judge didn't care about any plea agreement. He said I was a monster who deserved to die for what I'd done." After 3 days of initial meetings, David returned to his office in Oakwood Falls with a clear understanding of what he was facing. 3 women had been condemned to death, not because they were guilty of the crimes charged, but because they had threatened powerful interests or fallen victim to systematic institutional failures. Each case represented a different type of injustice, but together they painted a picture of a legal system that had been corrupted beyond its ability to deliver actual justice. David also understood that traditional legal remedies were no longer available. Appeals had been exhausted, evidence had been destroyed or hidden, witnesses had been silenced or disappeared. The normal mechanisms for correcting wrongful convictions had been systematically undermined by people with the resources and connections to manipulate the entire process. But David had learned something else during his visits to death row. Sarah, Elena and Jasmine weren't just victims waiting to die. They were intelligent, capable women who had been broken by circumstances beyond their control but not destroyed by them. With the right support, the right resources, and the right plan, they might still be capable of fighting for their own salvation. As David sat in his office that evening, planning his next moves, he felt the familiar surge of purpose that had driven his career in victim advocacy. The difference was that this time, he wasn't just fighting for justice within the system, he was preparing to fight against the system itself, using methods that went far beyond anything he had attempted before. The gentle giant who had spent his career helping others heal was about to become something else entirely, a revolutionary willing to risk everything to give 3 forgotten women a chance at life itself. David Harrison's investigation began not with dramatic confrontations or high-tech surveillance, but with something far more mundane and infinitely more dangerous: paperwork. For 3 weeks, he used every professional connection he had built over 15 years to access files, records, and documents that powerful people had assumed were safely buried in bureaucratic archives. His first breakthrough came through an unlikely source: Rebecca Chun, a former prosecutor turned whistleblower who had been quietly documenting corruption in the district attorney's office for the past 5 years. Rebecca had contacted David after hearing through professional networks that he was asking questions about irregularities in capital murder cases. They met at a small diner outside Harrisburg, far from any courthouse or law enforcement facility, where their conversation might be overheard. Rebecca was a small, intense woman in her 40s who carried herself with the coiled tension of someone who knew too much about dangerous people. "I've been building a case against District Attorney William Morrison for years," Rebecca told David as they sat in a corner booth, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been taking money from defense attorneys in exchange for throwing cases, but he's also been railroading defendants when it serves his political interests." Rebecca explained that Morrison operated what amounted to a criminal enterprise from within the prosecutor's office. He had partnerships with certain defense attorneys who paid him to ensure their clients received favorable plea deals. Meanwhile, he pursued high-profile convictions against defendants who couldn't afford competent representation, using fabricated evidence and prosecutorial misconduct to guarantee guilty verdicts that enhanced his reputation as a tough-on-crime politician. "Sarah Rodriguez was a perfect target," Rebecca continued, sliding a manila folder across the table. "High-profile case, media attention, victim who was popular in Hollywood. Morrison knew that getting a death sentence would make him a hero to law and order voters." The folder contained copies of internal memos that revealed the systematic suppression of evidence in Sarah's case. Witnesses who had testified to Marcus Huntington's pattern of abuse had been intimidated into silence by private investigators hired through untraceable shell companies. The medical examiner who had found evidence of defensive wounds on Sarah's body had been pressured to alter his report by Morrison's office. Most damning was a recorded phone conversation between Morrison and one of Huntington's business partners, discussing how the case needed to be handled carefully to protect certain Hollywood interests. The conversation made it clear that Sarah's conviction had been predetermined, with the trial serving merely as theater to legitimize a foregone conclusion. "Why haven't you gone public with this?" David asked. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "I've tried. Every journalist I've contacted has been pressured to drop the story. Every law enforcement agency I've approached has connections to Morrison or his political allies. The FBI claims they don't have jurisdiction. The state attorney general's office says the evidence is inconclusive." David understood the problem. Morrison wasn't just a corrupt prosecutor. He was a central figure in a network of corruption that extended throughout Pennsylvania's legal and political establishments. Taking him down would require evidence so overwhelming that it couldn't be suppressed or ignored. And even then, success would depend on finding honest officials willing to risk their careers for justice. His investigation into Elena Brooks' case led him to Dr. Amanda Foster, a former colleague of Elena's who had left Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh under suspicious circumstances 3 months before Elena's arrest. Amanda had agreed to meet David at her new practice in Cleveland, a small clinic that served low-income families, a dramatic step down from her previous position as a department chief at a prestigious hospital. Elena was the best nurse I ever worked with, Amanda told David as they sat in her modest office. She had an instinct for spotting problems that others missed, and she never gave up on a patient. That's what made her so dangerous to the people who were covering up the contaminated insulin situation. Amanda explained that the insulin contamination had been the result of cost-cutting measures implemented by the hospital's new management company, a for-profit corporation that had purchased Children's Hospital from its previous nonprofit board. The company had switched to a cheaper insulin supplier without properly vetting the manufacturing standards, resulting in contaminated batches that caused deadly blood sugar crashes in pediatric patients. When children started dying, the administration's first instinct was to cover it up rather than acknowledge the problem, Amanda continued. They knew that admitting they had used substandard medications would result in massive lawsuits and regulatory sanctions that could bankrupt the hospital. Elena had been framed as a convenient scapegoat nurse with access to insulin and a history of being emotionally affected by patient deaths. The real evidence of contamination had been destroyed, replaced with falsified lab reports that supported the prosecution's theory of deliberate poisoning. I tried to speak up during Elena's trial, Amanda said, her voice filled with regret. But my testimony was ruled inadmissible because I had been fired for insubordination before the murders occurred. The judge said my claims about contamination were speculative and prejudicial. Amanda had been forced to choose between her career and her conscience. When she continued trying to expose the truth, she found herself blacklisted from major hospitals throughout Pennsylvania. Her only option had been to relocate and start over in a different state, leaving Elena to face execution alone. The most difficult investigation was into Jasmine Williams' case, because it involved not just corruption, but a web of domestic violence and drug trafficking that had tentacles throughout law enforcement. David's breakthrough came through an unexpected source, Marcus Thompson himself, who was currently serving time in a federal prison for drug distribution charges. David's visit to FCI McKean required special permissions and careful preparation. Thompson was a dangerous man with connections to violent criminal organizations, and David had no illusions about what the convicted drug dealer might do if he felt threatened. But David also understood that Thompson was the only person who could provide direct testimony about what had actually happened the night Destiny Williams died. The man David met in the federal prison's visiting room was smaller than he had expected. Lean and wiry with the predatory alertness of someone who had survived years in violent environments. Thompson's eyes held the flat affect of a sociopath, but David detected something else beneath the surface, a kind of paranoid intelligence. That suggested the man understood exactly how precarious his situation had become. "I know who you are," Thompson said without preamble. "You're the counselor asking questions about Jasmine's case. People have been talking." David had prepared for this moment, understanding that Thompson would respond only to approaches that served his own interests. "I'm here because I think you've been painted as someone you're not," David said carefully. "The official record makes it look like you were just an innocent bystander when your daughter died." Thompson's expression shifted slightly, and David saw a flicker of what might have been amusement. "Innocent bystander. That's good. I like that." Over the next hour, David maneuvered Thompson into telling his version of events, using the man's narcissism and need to appear dominant to extract admissions that no prosecutor had ever obtained. Thompson bragged about his control over Jasmine, about his connections to corrupt police officers, about the way he had managed to frame her for a crime he had committed while high on methamphetamine. "The stupid bitch thought she could protect the baby," Thompson said with casual cruelty. "But I was seeing things that night, you know? Thinking the kid was part of some conspiracy against me. When Jasmine tried to get in my way, I had to show her who was in charge." David felt sick listening to Thompson's confession, but he forced himself to continue asking questions that would establish a clear record of the man's guilt. Thompson seemed to enjoy reliving his domination of Jasmine, describing in detail how he had orchestrated her conviction through bribes and threats directed at key witnesses and officials. "Best investment I ever made," Thompson concluded. "Cost me maybe 50 grand in bribes, but it kept me out of the death chamber and put that bitch where she belonged." David left the federal prison with a recording that contained Thompson's explicit confession to murdering his own daughter and framing Jasmine for the crime. But he also understood that obtaining the confession had been the easy part. Thompson had been willing to talk because he believed he was untouchable, protected by double jeopardy laws and prosecutorial agreements that would prevent him from ever being retried for his daughter's murder. Back in his office, David compiled the evidence he had gathered into 3 comprehensive files that documented the systematic corruption underlying each woman's conviction. The evidence was overwhelming, incontrovertible, and legally worthless. Every piece of information he had obtained would be ruled inadmissible in court due to procedural technicalities, statute of limitations issues, or jurisdictional problems. Rebecca Chun's recordings had been obtained without warrants. Dr. Amanda Foster's testimony would be dismissed as the bitter complaints of a disgruntled former employee. Marcus Thompson's confession, while damning, couldn't be used to overturn Jasmine's conviction because he hadn't been under oath and had admitted to crimes for which he had already been prosecuted. David realized that he was facing the same impossible situation that had destroyed his sister's case 25 years earlier. The evidence of innocence existed, but the system was designed to prevent that evidence from ever being heard by people with the power to act on it. Courts would hide behind procedural rules, prosecutors would claim jurisdictional limitations, and politicians would express concern while taking no meaningful action. That evening, as David sat in his office reviewing the futile legal options available to him, he received a phone call that changed everything. The caller was Thomas Patterson, an investigative journalist who had been quietly following David's inquiries through sources in the legal community. "Mr. Harrison," Patterson said, "I understand you've been looking into some capital murder cases with unusual circumstances. I think we need to talk." Patterson explained that he had been investigating corruption in Pennsylvania's criminal justice system for the past 3 years, building a comprehensive expose that would expose the network of judges, prosecutors, and politicians who had turned the courts into profit centers for private interests. "I have most of the story," Patterson said, "but I need victims. People whose cases clearly demonstrate the human cost of this corruption. Your 3 women could be the faces that make this story impossible to ignore." David felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by the crushing realization of what Patterson was actually offering. A newspaper expose might generate public outrage, might even result in investigations and reforms, but it wouldn't save Sarah, Elena, and Jasmine. Their execution dates were approaching too quickly for any journalistic investigation to affect their cases. "How long before you could publish?" David asked. 6 months minimum," Patterson replied. "Maybe longer if they try to suppress it through legal challenges." David hung up the phone knowing that traditional solutions, legal appeals, journalistic exposes, political interventions, would not save the 3 women who were counting down their final weeks in death row cells. The system was too corrupt, too well protected, too invested in maintaining its own legitimacy to allow meaningful challenges to its authority. But David had learned something important during his weeks of investigation. The network of corruption that had condemned Sarah, Elena, and Jasmine wasn't just vast, it was also vulnerable in ways that its architects hadn't anticipated. The same connections that made the system powerful also made it fragile, dependent on the continued cooperation of people who might be persuaded to change sides if the right pressure was applied. David's terminal cancer diagnosis had given him one crucial advantage: freedom from consequences. A man with months to live could take risks that others couldn't afford, could challenge people who might retaliate against someone with a longer future to protect. As David began planning his next moves, he understood that he was about to cross a line that would transform him from advocate to revolutionary. The gentle giant who had spent his career working within the system was preparing to declare war against it, using methods that would either save 3 innocent women or destroy him in the attempt. The investigation phase was over. The real battle was about to begin. David Harrison's transformation from counselor to revolutionary began with a single phone call to someone he had hoped never to contact again: Vincent "Vinny" Morrison, his brother-in-law's cousin who operated in the shadowy spaces between legal and illegal activity. Vinny ran a private investigation agency that specialized in cases traditional law enforcement wouldn't touch: missing persons who didn't want to be found, evidence that needed to disappear, problems that required solutions outside the boundaries of conventional morality. The two men met at a truck stop outside of Pittsburgh, neutral territory where their conversation wouldn't be overheard by anyone who mattered. Vinny was a small man with prematurely gray hair and the sharp eyes of someone who had survived decades in dangerous professions. He listened without interruption as David explained what he needed: new identities for 3 women who were legally dead but morally innocent. "You're talking about something that's never been done before," Vinny said when David finished his explanation. "Breaking people out of death row isn't like helping someone disappear from an abusive relationship. The resources they'd put into finding these women would be unlimited. FBI, U.S. Marshals, Interpol, if they thought they'd left the country." David had anticipated this objection. What if they weren't escaping? What if they were already dead? Vinny's eyebrows raised with interest. "Keep talking." David outlined the plan that had been forming in his mind since his investigation revealed the futility of legal remedies. Instead of trying to break the women out of prison, he would help them die officially while ensuring they survived actually. The plan required split-second timing, medical expertise, and the cooperation of people inside the prison system who could be trusted to prioritize justice over regulations. "The execution chamber at Riverside uses lethal injection," David explained. 3 drugs administered in sequence: a sedative, a paralytic agent, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. But what if the potassium chloride was replaced with something that would create the appearance of death while leaving the women alive? Vinny was quiet for a long moment, working through the logistics and implications. "You'd need someone on the medical team willing to risk their career and freedom. You'd need a way to transport the bodies after the supposed executions. And you'd need identity so perfect that the women could live normal lives without fear of discovery." David nodded. "I have connections to people who might be willing to help. The question is whether you can provide the technical support to make it work." Vinny's answer came without hesitation. "For the right cause and the right price, I can provide anything you need. But David, you understand what you're asking? If this goes wrong, everyone involved will spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. And that's if we're lucky." David thought about Sarah's haunted eyes, Elena's meticulous documentation of hospital corruption, Jasmine's quiet desperation. He thought about his sister Emma, about all the victims he had been unable to save over the years, about the terminal cancer diagnosis that had given him nothing left to lose. "I understand," he said simply. The recruitment of co-conspirators required David to leverage every relationship he had built during 15 years of victim advocacy. His first approach was to Dr. Michael Chun, the prison's chief medical officer, and someone David had worked with years earlier on a case involving medical malpractice. Chun was a good man trapped in a bad system, someone who had watched too many executions of people whose guilt he privately questioned. They met at Shun's home on a Sunday evening when his family was visiting relatives in Philadelphia. David laid out his evidence of the three women's innocence, then explained his plan for saving them. Shun listened with the careful attention of someone trained to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. "What you're proposing is medical fraud on a massive scale," Chun said when David finished. "I could lose my license, face criminal charges, spend decades in prison." "What's the alternative?" David replied. "You continue participating in the execution of innocent women while telling yourself that you're just following orders." Shun walked to his study window, looking out at his garden where his children played during happier times. When he turned back to David, his expression had changed from uncertainty to resolution. "I've been struggling with this job for years," Chun admitted. "Every execution keeps me awake at night, wondering if we're killing someone who doesn't deserve to die. If you can provide absolute proof that these women are innocent, I'll help you save them." The next recruit was Transportation Supervisor Janet Washington, who controlled the movement of bodies from the prison to the county morgue. Janet was a single mother whose teenage son had been killed by a drunk driver who received probation due to his family's political connections. She understood how wealth and influence could corrupt justice, and she had been quietly documenting irregularities in the prison's operations for years. David approached Janet through Margaret Foster, the social worker who had first contacted him about the three women. Margaret arranged a meeting at Janet's church where they could speak privately after the evening service. "I've been watching these women for months," Janet told David. "Reading their files, seeing how they carry themselves. They don't act like killers. They act like people who've been broken by circumstances beyond their control." Janet's role would be crucial to the plan's success. After the supposed executions, she would need to ensure that the bodies were transported to a specific funeral home owned by one of Vinnie's associates rather than the county morgue where autopsies might reveal that the women were still alive. "Can you guarantee that the transport won't be observed by officials who aren't part of our plan?" David asked. Janet nodded confidently. "I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know every procedure, every person who might be watching. If you can give me the right paperwork and the right timing, I can make sure those women get where they need to go." The most dangerous recruitment was Guard Captain Robert Williams, a 20-year veteran of the corrections system whose integrity had made him enemies among colleagues who profited from the various forms of corruption that flourished in prison environments. Williams had a reputation for treating inmates with dignity and following regulations precisely, qualities that would be essential for maintaining the illusion of normal execution procedures. David met Williams at a veterans hall where the guard captain volunteered teaching job skills to ex-convicts trying to rebuild their lives. It was a sign of Williams' character that he spent his free time helping people whom society had written off as irredeemable. "I know why you're here," Williams said before David could explain his mission. "Word gets around when someone starts asking the right questions about death row cases. I've been wondering when someone would finally pay attention to the irregularities in those women's convictions." Williams had been present during numerous executions over his career, and he had developed his own concerns about the justice system's reliability. Too many of the condemned prisoners he had known seemed psychologically inconsistent with the crimes they had allegedly committed. Too many cases involved evidence that didn't quite fit, witnesses whose testimony changed, lawyers who seemed more interested in ending cases quickly than defending their clients effectively. "I can ensure that the execution protocols are followed exactly as you need them to be," Williams told David. "But I want something in return. When this is over, when these women are safe, I want you to help me expose the corruption that allowed their convictions to happen in the first place." David agreed immediately. Williams' demand aligned perfectly with his own commitment to ensuring that the network of corruption would be dismantled. even if it took years to accomplish. The final piece of the conspiracy was the most delicate, creating new identities that would allow the three women to live normal lives without fear of discovery. This required not just false documents, but complete backstories that would withstand intensive scrutiny from law enforcement, agencies that would never stop looking for escaped death row inmates. Vinnie Morrison had connections to document forgers, who specialized in creating identities for people in federal witness protection programs. These weren't simple fake IDs, but comprehensive identity packages that included birth certificates, social security numbers, educational records, employment histories, and medical files that could pass examination by any government agency. Each identity will cost $200,000, Vinnie explained during a follow-up meeting. That covers not just the documents, but the electronic records that need to be inserted into government databases. We're talking about creating people who have existed on paper since birth, complete with fingerprints and dental records that match the women who will be using these identities. David had been expecting this financial obstacle. His savings from 15 years of counseling work amounted to less than $100,000, nowhere near the $600,000 needed for 3 complete identities. But his terminal cancer diagnosis had given him access to resources he had never considered using: his life insurance policy. "I can arrange for the payment," David told Vinnie, "but I'll need several weeks to liquidate assets and adjust my financial arrangements." What David didn't mention was that paying for the new identities would require him to accelerate his own death timeline. The life insurance policy would only pay if his death appeared natural, which meant he couldn't afford to wait for the cancer to kill him slowly. He would need to arrange his own death in a way that would provide the resources necessary to save the 3 women, while appearing to be the result of his terminal illness. As the conspiracy took shape, David found himself meeting regularly with each woman to prepare them for what was coming. These sessions required careful balance. He needed to give them hope without revealing details that could compromise the plan if they were overheard by guards or recorded by surveillance equipment. "I want you to know that people are working on your cases," he told each woman during individual sessions. "There are developments that I can't discuss yet, but I need you to be ready for possibilities that might seem impossible right now." Sarah was the quickest to understand what David was implying. "You're talking about something outside the legal system, aren't you? Something that could get people in serious trouble." David's response was carefully neutral. "I'm talking about hope. Sometimes hope requires taking risks that seem unreasonable to people who haven't walked in your shoes." Elena approached the situation with medical curiosity. If someone were to hypothetically survive an execution, what would be the medical challenges involved in maintaining life while appearing dead? David appreciated her analytical approach. Hypothetically, it would require precise knowledge of pharmaceutical interactions and access to medications that could counteract the effects of execution drugs. It would also require medical personnel willing to risk their careers for justice. Jasmine was the most frightened by the implications of David's hints. "Are you saying someone might try to help us escape? Because if this goes wrong, they'll make sure we suffer before they kill us again." David understood her fear. "I'm saying that innocent people deserve a chance at life, and sometimes that chance comes from unexpected directions. When the time comes, I need you to trust the people who are trying to help you, even if their methods seem frightening." As the execution dates approached, Sarah's scheduled for March 15th, Elena's for March 22nd, and Jasmine's for March 29th. David finalized the medical and logistical arrangements that would either save 3 innocent women or destroy everyone who had tried to help them. The plan they had developed was extraordinarily complex, requiring split-second timing and flawless execution by people who had never worked together before. But it was also their only chance to correct injustices that the legal system had proved incapable of addressing. David spent his final weeks making peace with the knowledge that he would not live to see whether their efforts succeeded. His own death was scheduled for March 10th, carefully timed to appear natural while providing the insurance money necessary to complete the new identity process. As he prepared to sacrifice his remaining time for the chance to save 3 women. He barely knew, David felt the same sense of purpose that had driven his career in victim advocacy. The difference was that this time, he wasn't just helping victims heal, he was helping them reclaim their lives completely. The Underground Railroad that would carry Sarah, Elena, and Jasmine from death to rebirth was ready to begin operation. All that remained was to execute a plan so audacious that its very impossibility might be the key to its success. March 8, 2024. David Harrison sat in his oncologist's office receiving news that he had orchestrated himself. Dr. Patricia Kellerman's face bore the grave expression of someone delivering a death sentence, unaware that her patient had already written his own ending. "The cancer has progressed much faster than we anticipated," Dr. Kellerman said, studying the falsified test results that David had arranged through Vinnie Morrison's network. "I'm afraid we're looking at days rather than weeks. I strongly recommend immediate hospice care." David nodded with the resignation of someone receiving expected bad news. In reality, the progression was artificial chemically induced symptoms that mimicked rapid cancer advancement while ensuring his death would occur precisely when needed to fund the rescue operation. The life insurance policy required only that his death appear natural, a requirement he could fulfill while maintaining complete control over the timing. "I'd like to spend my final days at home," David said. "Is that possible?" Dr. Kellerman's expression softened with sympathy. "Of course. I'll arrange for palliative care specialists to make you as comfortable as possible." That evening, David returned to his house in Oakwood Falls for the last time. The modest 2-story home where he had lived for 15 years suddenly felt like a museum of his life filled with books on trauma counseling, photographs from cases where he had made a difference, letters from clients whose lives he had helped rebuild. Everything would soon belong to someone else, but none of it mattered compared to the 3 women whose lives hung in the balance. His final phone call was to Margaret Foster, the social worker who had first contacted him about the death row cases. Margaret had become the unofficial coordinator of their conspiracy, the person who could communicate with all the participants without arousing suspicion from prison authorities. "Everything is in place," David told her, his voice steady despite the knowledge that he would be dead within 48 hours. "The medical protocols have been tested, the transportation arrangements are confirmed, and the new identities will be ready within hours of the supposed executions." Margaret's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. "David, are you certain about your own role in this? There might be other ways to fund the operation without. There are no other ways." David interrupted gently. "The timing has to be perfect, and the money has to be available immediately. This is the only solution that guarantees success." After hanging up, David began the careful process of ending his own life in a way that would appear completely natural to medical authorities. The combination of medications he had obtained through Vinnie's network would create symptoms indistinguishable from rapid cancer progression, ensuring that his death certificate would list natural causes while triggering immediate life insurance payment. March 10, 2024, 3:17 a.m. David Harrison died peacefully in his sleep, his massive frame finally at rest in the bed where he had spent countless nights planning the salvation of 3 women he had known for less than 3 months. The hospice nurse who found him saw exactly what she expected. A man whose battle with cancer had finally ended. The insurance settlement was processed with unusual speed, thanks to Vinnie Morrison's connections in the financial industry. By March 12th, $600,000 had been transferred to accounts that would fund the most audacious rescue operation in American criminal justice history. March 15th, 2024. Sarah Rodriguez's execution day arrived with the bureaucratic efficiency That characterized all state-sanctioned killings. The media attention was minimal after 3 years on death row. Public interest in her case had faded to occasional mentions in true crime forums and academic discussions about celebrity justice. Sarah woke at 5 a.m. to find guard Captain Robert Williams standing outside her cell with the expression of professional solemnity that marked execution days. What the surveillance cameras couldn't capture was the barely perceptible nod Williams gave her, the signal that David's plan was proceeding as scheduled. "Time for your final preparations, Ms. Rodriguez," Williams said in a voice loud enough for the recording equipment to capture. "The chaplain is waiting to speak with you." The chaplain was actually Dr. Michael Chun, wearing clerical clothing, taking advantage of the privacy accorded to spiritual counselors during final hours. Under the guise of last rites, Chun administered the first of 3 injections that would prepare Sarah's body for the chemical theater they were about to perform. "This will slow your heart rate and create the appearance of sedation," Chun whispered as he prepared the syringe. "During the actual execution, you'll feel the effects of the first 2 drugs, but the 3rd injection will be a powerful stimulant rather than potassium chloride. You'll lose consciousness, but your heart will continue beating. The key is to remain completely still no matter what you hear or feel." Sarah nodded her understanding, feeling strangely calm despite the enormity of what was happening. The past weeks of preparation with David had given her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her arrest. Whether the plan succeeded or failed, at least she would die knowing that someone had believed in her innocence enough to risk everything for her freedom. At 2 p.m., Sarah was transported to the execution chamber, a sterile room that resembled a medical facility more than the site of state-sanctioned killing. The witnesses included representatives from the victim's family, prison officials, media observers, and one man whose presence seemed unusual: Thomas Patterson, the investigative journalist who had contacted David weeks earlier. Patterson had used his press credentials to gain access to the execution, not to report on Sarah's death, but to document any irregularities that might support the expose he was preparing about corruption in the Pennsylvania justice system. He had no knowledge of the rescue operation, but his presence would provide additional evidence that something unusual had occurred. Warden Patricia Hawkins read the death warrant with the mechanical precision of someone who had overseen dozens of executions. Sarah was strapped to the gurney with restraints that seemed unnecessarily elaborate for someone about to die, but which served the secret purpose of preventing involuntary movement that might reveal she was still alive. Dr. Chun approached the 4 lines with the solemnity appropriate to his official role as execution physician. The witnesses watched through reinforced glass as he administered the first injection, a genuine sedative that would make Sarah appear unconscious. The second injection was a paralytic agent that would prevent any visible signs of breathing or reflexive movement. The 3rd injection was the moment of greatest risk. Instead of potassium chloride, Chun injected a carefully calibrated mixture of medications that would create cardiac arrest symptoms while actually supporting heart function. Sarah's body went completely still, her heart rate dropping to levels barely detectable by standard monitoring equipment. The official time of death was recorded as 2:47 p.m. The witnesses observed 60 seconds of complete stillness before being escorted from the viewing area. Sarah Rodriguez was officially dead, her body ready for transport to what everyone believed would be the county morgue. Janet Washington took control of the body with the efficiency that had characterized her 12 years in the transportation department. The death certificate had been pre-signed by Dr. Chun, listing cardiac arrest as the cause of death. The transport paperwork directed the body to Morrison Family Funeral Home, a detail that wouldn't be questioned until much later. The funeral home was owned by Vincent Morrison Jr., Vinnie's cousin, who specialized in providing services for people who preferred to avoid government attention. The facility's basement contained medical equipment that rivaled most emergency rooms, Staffed by personnel who had been trained to handle unusual circumstances, Sarah regained consciousness 6 hours after her supposed execution, awakening in a hospital bed surrounded by people she had never seen before. Her first words were a whispered question. "Did it work?" "You're alive," said Dr. Amanda Foster, Elena's former colleague, who had joined the conspiracy after David's death. "As far as the world knows, Sarah Rodriguez died this afternoon. But the woman who woke up in this bed is someone else entirely." The new identity documents identified her as Catherine Marie Thompson, a 29-year-old graphic designer from Seattle who had moved to Pennsylvania to care for an elderly relative. The backstory was complete down to college transcripts, employment records, and social media accounts that had been active for years thanks to Vinny's network of digital specialists. March 22, 2024. Elena Brooks' execution followed the same protocol with modifications based on lessons learned from Sarah's case. Elena's medical background made her the most challenging subject, since she would recognize the effects of the drugs being administered and might react in ways that could compromise the illusion. Dr. Chun addressed this problem by providing Elena with detailed explanations of each medication's purpose during their final consultation. Elena's scientific curiosity helped her maintain emotional control, even as she experienced the terrifying sensation of chemical-induced paralysis while remaining partially conscious. "Remember," Chun whispered as he prepared the IV lines, "you'll feel like you're dying, but the medications are designed to protect your vital organs while creating the appearance of death. Trust the process, even when your medical training tells you something is wrong." Elena's execution was witnessed by hospital administrators who had traveled from Pittsburgh to ensure that their former employee was definitively eliminated. They watched with satisfaction as the woman who had threatened to expose their corruption appeared to die from the same type of chemical intervention she had allegedly used to kill children in their care. Elena's transformation was the most dramatic of the three. The new identity created for her was Dr. Lisa Catherine Martinez, a family practitioner who had completed her residency in New Mexico before moving to Pennsylvania to join a rural health clinic. The identity came complete with medical license, malpractice insurance, and patient records that would allow her to resume practicing medicine under careful supervision. March 29, 2024. Jasmine Williams' execution was the most emotionally charged of the three, drawing protesters who argued that executing someone for killing their own child violated fundamental principles of justice and mercy. The protesters had no idea they were witnessing an elaborate performance designed to save rather than kill the young woman they were trying to protect. Jasmine's youth and obvious psychological fragility made her case the most difficult for the execution team to handle professionally. Several guards had privately expressed doubts about the justice of killing someone who seemed more like a victim than a perpetrator, creating additional stress during the execution process. Guard Captain Williams used this emotional atmosphere to his advantage, ensuring that personnel were focused on managing their own distress rather than closely monitoring technical procedures. The execution proceeded without incident, with Jasmine's apparent death recorded at 3:15 p.m. The new identity created for Jasmine was the most carefully crafted of the three. Jessica Ann Walker was a 25-year-old elementary school teacher who had grown up in foster care before earning her education degree through scholarship programs. The identity reflected Jasmine's gentle nature, while providing a profession that would allow her to help children without the scrutiny that might come with other careers. By April 1, 2024, 3 women had been officially executed by the state of Pennsylvania for crimes they had not committed. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves after brief ceremonies attended only by the prison chaplain and required officials. The cases were closed. The victims' families had achieved the closure they sought, and the justice system had demonstrated its commitment to holding criminals accountable for their actions. but in 3 different cities across the country. 3 women were beginning new lives with new names, new histories, and new possibilities for futures that had been stolen from them by corruption and injustice. Catherine Thompson was learning to navigate her identity as a graphic designer in Portland, Oregon. Dr. Lisa Martinez was establishing her practice in a small town in Colorado. Jessica Walker was preparing to begin her teaching career in an elementary school in Vermont. The execution of David Harrison's plan had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. 3 innocent women had been saved from death, given complete new identities, and provided with the resources necessary to build meaningful lives. The network of corruption that had condemned them remained in place, but its victims had escaped its reach through the sacrifice of a gentle giant who had given his life to ensure their freedom. The most audacious rescue operation in American criminal justice history was complete. Now the real challenge would begin, helping 3 broken women learn how to live again. 6 months after her official death, Catherine Thompson stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her Portland apartment, struggling to recognize the woman staring back at her. The face was familiar, the same dark eyes, the same bone structure that had once graced magazine covers, but everything else had changed. Her hair was shorter now, dyed auburn instead of black. Contact lenses had turned. Her brown eyes hazel. Subtle cosmetic procedures had altered the shape of her nose and cheekbones, just enough to defeat facial recognition software. But the most profound changes weren't physical. The woman in the mirror carried herself differently than Sarah Rodriguez ever had. There was a wariness in her posture, a hypervigilance that came from knowing that discovery meant not just exposure, but a return to death row and an execution that would be far less merciful than the first one. Catherine's new life in Portland was carefully constructed around the legend that Vinnie Morrison's network had created for her. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, operating from her apartment and maintaining minimal contact with clients through digital platforms. The work provided sufficient income to live modestly while allowing her to avoid the kind of personal relationships that might lead to questions about her past. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in Portland's Pearl District, chosen specifically for its multiple exit routes and the anonymity that came with living among young professionals who minded their own business. The space was spartanly furnished, nothing that couldn't be abandoned within minutes if circumstances required sudden departure. The most challenging aspect of Catherine's new existence wasn't the constant fear of discovery, but the isolation that safety required. She had been Sarah Rodriguez for 28 years, an actress who thrived on human connection and emotional expression. Catherine Thompson was a ghost by necessity, someone who couldn't afford to form meaningful relationships or reveal authentic emotions that might contradict her manufactured history. Her only contact with her former life came through encrypted communications with Margaret Foster, who provided updates on the other women and monitored law enforcement interest in their cases. The messages were brief and coded, but they provided Catherine with the psychological anchor she needed to maintain hope that someday she might be able to live openly again. Package delivery confirmed for all recipients. Margaret's latest message. Read: no return requests from original vendors. New addresses working well. Catherine understood the code. All 3 women were alive and safe, with no signs that authorities suspected the executions had been faked. But she also knew that safety was temporary, dependent on their ability to maintain perfect operational security for the rest of their lives. 800 miles away, in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, Dr. Lisa Martinez was facing different, but equally complex challenges in rebuilding her identity. The mountain town's small population made anonymity more difficult, but it also provided the kind of close-knit community support that Elena Brooks had always thrived on during her nursing career. Lisa's new practice focused on family medicine, serving a patient population that included ranchers, ski resort employees, and the growing number of remote workers who had moved to Colorado during the pandemic. The work was similar enough to her previous specialty that she could draw on her medical training, while different enough to require new learning. That helped distract from the trauma of her previous life. The most dangerous moment in Lisa's new existence had come during her third week of practice, when a visiting specialist from Denver had remarked that she reminded him of someone he had known years earlier. Lisa had managed to deflect the comment with a laugh about having one of those faces, but the incident had reinforced how fragile her new identity remained. To strengthen her cover story, Lisa had begun dating Tom Bradley, a local contractor, whose uncomplicated nature provided both companionship and camouflage. Tom accepted her reluctance to discuss her past as evidence of painful experiences rather than criminal deception, and his protective instincts helped shield her from the kind of scrutiny that might come from other residents. But the relationship also created new forms of stress. Tom's genuine affection for the woman he knew as Lisa Martinez forced her to confront the impossibility of authentic intimacy when her entire existence was based on deception. She found herself caring for him while knowing that their relationship was built on lies that could never be revealed without destroying both their lives. The medical practice itself provided psychological healing that Elena Brooks had never expected to experience again. Each patient she helped, each crisis she navigated successfully, reinforced her sense of purpose and competence that the corrupt hospital system had tried to destroy. The mountain community's trust in her professional judgment gradually rebuilt the confidence that had been shattered by her wrongful conviction. In Vermont, Jessica Walker was discovering that working with children provided both the greatest joy and the deepest pain of her new existence. The elementary school where she taught was located in Middlebury, a college town where her background as a foster care graduate who had overcome adversity to become an educator was viewed as inspirational rather than suspicious. Jessica's classroom was filled with the kind of energy and hope that had been absent from her life since Destiny's death. 22 third graders who called her Ms. Walker and brought her drawings they had made at home, who trusted her to help them with problems, both academic and personal. The work reminded her daily of what she had lost when her daughter was murdered, but it also provided a sense of purpose that made survival feel worthwhile. The most challenging aspect of Jessica's new identity was the way it forced her to confront her capacity for maternal feelings. Several of her students reminded her of Destiny at different ages, triggering memories that could reduce her to tears during unexpected moments. She had learned to excuse herself from the classroom when these episodes occurred, claiming allergies or phone calls that required privacy. Her principal, Martha Henderson, had become an unofficial mentor who seemed to sense that Jessica carried hidden trauma without prying into specifics. Martha's support provided the kind of professional protection that allowed Jessica to navigate difficult days when grief threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed composure. "You have a gift with the troubled children," Martha had observed during Jessica's 6-month evaluation. "It's like you understand what they're going through in ways that other teachers don't." Jessica had simply nodded, unable to explain that. Her understanding came from personal experience with violence and loss that no child should ever endure. The irony that she had been executed for killing a child while dedicating her new life to protecting children was not lost on her, but it also provided a sense of cosmic justice that helped heal wounds that legal vindication could never have addressed. All 3 women struggled with the psychological complexity of living as someone else while honoring the memory of who they had been. Catherine found herself unconsciously slipping into Sarah's mannerisms during unguarded moments, forcing her to constantly monitor her behavior for inconsistencies that might betray her true identity. Lisa discovered that her medical knowledge sometimes extended beyond what Dr. Martinez's fabricated educational background would support, requiring her to pretend ignorance about procedures she could perform in her sleep. Jessica had to resist the impulse to share stories from her previous life when colleagues discussed their backgrounds and experiences. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of their new existence. None of them could form authentic relationships based on truth, which meant that even positive social connections carried an underlying sadness. They were surrounded by people who cared about them, but those people were caring for carefully constructed personas rather than their authentic selves. Margaret Foster's periodic updates provided crucial psychological support, reminding each woman that she wasn't alone in her struggle to rebuild her identity. The encrypted messages also served as proof that their sacrifice had meaning beyond personal survival. They were part of a larger effort to expose and dismantle the corruption that had destroyed their previous lives. Research project proceeding. Ahead of schedule, one of Margaret's messages reported. Documentation phase nearly complete. Publication timeline moved up due to new evidence. The women understood that Thomas Patterson's expose of Pennsylvania's criminal justice corruption was approaching publication, which would eventually vindicate their innocence even if they could never publicly claim that vindication. The knowledge that the truth would eventually emerge provided a sense of purpose that helped sustain them through the loneliness and constant vigilance their survival required. As their first year of new life progressed, each woman began to develop coping strategies that allowed her to find meaning and even happiness within the constraints of false identity. Catherine discovered that her graphic design work could serve social justice causes, using her artistic talents to create materials for organizations that help domestic violence victims and wrongfully convicted prisoners. The work felt like a way of honoring David Harrison's sacrifice while contributing to causes that reflected her authentic values. Lisa began volunteering at a women's shelter in a neighboring town, providing medical care to abuse victims who couldn't afford traditional health care. The work required her to drive 2 hours each way and use vacation time from her regular practice, but it allowed her to use her skills in service of people who reminded her of her own experience as a victim of institutional abuse. Jessica started an after-school program for children from troubled homes, using her own experience with trauma to help kids develop resilience and coping skills. The program operated under the school district's supervision, which provided official sanction while allowing her to make a meaningful difference in young lives that might otherwise be lost to violence or neglect. These volunteer activities provided each woman with a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival, transforming their rescue from death row into an opportunity to create positive change in the world. They couldn't reclaim their original identities or achieve public vindication for the injustices they had suffered, but they could use their new lives to help others who faced similar challenges. The first anniversary of their executions passed quietly, marked only by private moments of reflection on how much their lives had changed in 12 months. Catherine lit a candle in her Portland apartment, thinking about David Harrison and the impossible gift he had given her. Lisa hiked to a mountain peak above Steamboat Springs, watching the sunrise while contemplating the difference between existing and truly living. Jessica visited Destiny's grave in Pennsylvania, using vacation time to travel back east and pay respects to the daughter, whose death had led to her own symbolic resurrection. Each woman had learned that survival wasn't just about avoiding detection or maintaining false identities. It was about finding ways to honor the people they had been while embracing the possibilities of who they might become. They were no longer Sarah Rodriguez, Elena Brooks, and Jasmine Williams. Those women had died in the execution chamber. But Catherine Thompson, Dr. Lisa Martinez, and Jessica Walker were discovering that sometimes death could be the beginning of a more authentic life than the one that had been destroyed by corruption and injustice. The gentle giant who had sacrificed his life to save theirs had given them more than new identities. He had given them the chance to transform their pain into purpose, their victimization into advocacy, their isolation into service to others who needed the kind of help that only someone who had survived the unthinkable could provide. They were learning to live again, not as the people they had been, but as the people they were meant to become. 18 months after the executions, investigative journalist Thomas Patterson published Death by Design: How Pennsylvania's Criminal Justice System Manufactures Convictions in the Atlantic. A 15,000-word expose that sent shockwaves through the legal establishment and triggered the largest criminal justice investigation in the state's history. Patterson had spent those months meticulously documenting the network of corruption that extended from small-town courtrooms to the highest levels of state government. His investigation revealed a system where prosecutors traded favorable plea deals for campaign contributions, where judges received luxury vacations in exchange for predetermined sentences, and where defense attorneys deliberately sabotaged their clients' cases to maintain relationships with courthouse power brokers. The article opened with a devastating paragraph that immediately captured national attention. In Pennsylvania, justice isn't blind. It's been bought and paid for by the highest bidder. Over the past 5 years, at least 47 innocent people have been executed, imprisoned, or driven to suicide by a criminal justice system that operates more like an organized crime syndicate than a mechanism for determining guilt or innocence. Patterson's investigation had been aided by an unexpected source, Vincent Morrison, the private investigator who had helped orchestrate the fake executions. Vinny had approached Patterson 3 months earlier with an offer that was impossible to refuse: complete documentation of the corruption network in exchange for anonymity and immunity from prosecution. "I've spent 20 years working in the shadows of this system," Vinny had told Patterson during their first meeting. "I've seen how it really operates, who really controls it, and what they're willing to do to protect their interests. But I've also seen what happens to innocent people who get caught in their machinery." Vinny's files contained recorded conversations between prosecutors and defense attorneys discussing predetermined outcomes, financial records showing payments from railroad companies to judges hearing land disputes, and photographs of meetings between court officials and organized crime figures who controlled witness testimony in major cases. The section of Patterson's article dealing with wrongful executions focused heavily on 3 cases that exemplified different types of systematic failure: a Hollywood actress whose conviction had been orchestrated to protect powerful sexual predators, a nurse who had been framed to cover up corporate negligence that killed children, and a young mother whose domestic violence victimization had been transformed into evidence of her guilt. Patterson had used the names Sarah Rodriguez, Elena Brooks, and Jasmine Williams throughout his investigation, presenting their cases as examples of how innocent people could be destroyed by institutional corruption. He had no knowledge that the 3 women were still alive. Reading his article from apartments and offices across the country with a mixture of vindication and terror, the article's publication triggered immediate responses from multiple law enforcement agencies. The FBI announced a sweeping investigation into corruption in Pennsylvania's court system. The Department of Justice launched a civil rights inquiry into wrongful executions. The state attorney general, facing calls for his own resignation, appointed a special prosecutor to review all capital murder convictions from the past decade. But the most dramatic immediate consequence was the arrest of District Attorney William Morrison, who was taken into custody at his home on federal charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The same man who had orchestrated Sarah Rodriguez's conviction was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. Catherine Thompson read Patterson's article on her laptop in her Portland apartment, tears streaming down her face as she saw her story, Sarah's story, presented to the world with the dignity and respect it had never received during her trial. The article didn't just establish her innocence. It exposed the entire network of corruption that had destroyed her life and the lives of countless others. The vindication was everything she had dreamed of during her years on death row, but it also created new dangers. Media interest in the Fahey cases would lead to renewed scrutiny of the executions, potentially exposing irregularities that could reveal the fake deaths. Catherine realized that her survival now depended on the very corruption that had nearly killed her. The assumption that the system was too incompetent to have successfully faked executions would help protect her from suspicion. Dr. Lisa Martinez was treating a patient with pneumonia when her nurse handed her a tablet showing Patterson's article. Lisa excused herself and locked her office door, reading with growing amazement as her story was told with the clinical precision she had tried to bring to documenting the hospital's corruption. The article revealed details about the contaminated insulin that Elena Brooks had never been able to present in court. It named hospital administrators who had covered up the deaths and identified the pharmaceutical company that had knowingly shipped defective medications. Most importantly, it established beyond any doubt that Elena had been trying to save children's lives, not end them. Lisa's vindication was complicated by the knowledge that she could never publicly reclaim it. Elena Brooks had died in the execution chamber, and Dr. Lisa Martinez had no legal standing to claim Elena's exoneration. The truth had been revealed, but it was a truth that could never be personally claimed. Jessica Walker was reading to her third-grade class when her phone buzzed with a news alert about Patterson's article. She maintained her composure through the remainder of the school day, but that evening she sat in her car in the school parking lot, sobbing as she read the detailed account of how Jasmine Williams had been systematically destroyed by the very system that should have protected her from domestic violence. The article revealed that Marcus Thompson had been recorded bragging about framing Jasmine, that police officers had been paid to suppress evidence of his drug dealing and domestic violence, and that Jasmine's court-appointed attorney had received payments to ensure her conviction. The truth about Destiny's murder was finally public, but the mother who had been executed for the crime could never hold her vindication. The three women faced a cruel irony. Their innocence had been established beyond any doubt, but they could never claim the exoneration they had fought for years to achieve. They were vindicated ghosts, cleared of crimes they could never publicly acknowledge they hadn't committed. Patterson's article also revealed the existence of David Harrison's investigation and his mysterious death just days before the executions began. While Patterson didn't suggest that David's death had been anything other than natural, he presented enough information about the counselor's activities to raise questions about the timing and circumstances. Harrison had spent weeks documenting irregularities in the three women's cases, Patterson wrote. His files, recovered after his death, contained evidence that would have fundamentally challenged their convictions if it had been presented in court. The fact that this dedicated advocate died just before he could potentially save three innocent women adds another layer of tragedy to an already devastating miscarriage of justice. Margaret Foster contacted each woman through encrypted channels to warn them about the increased scrutiny their cases would receive. "The article changes everything," her message read. "Prepare for investigators to examine every aspect of the executions. Maintain absolute operational security until we assess the situation." The investigation that followed Patterson's article was more thorough than any of the conspiracy participants had anticipated. Federal investigators interviewed every person who had been present during the executions, reviewed all medical records and transportation logs, and conducted forensic examinations of the execution chamber and equipment. Dr. Michael Chun faced the most intense scrutiny, with investigators questioning him extensively about the medical procedures used during the executions. Chun's reputation for professionalism and his long history of conducting executions without incident helped deflect suspicion, but he was forced to submit to polygraph examinations and provide detailed explanations of every medical decision he had made. Guard Captain Robert Williams was questioned about security protocols and whether any irregularities had been observed during the executions. Williams' spotless record and his reputation for following procedures precisely helped establish that the executions had been conducted according to standard protocols. Janet Washington underwent the most dangerous scrutiny. with investigators examining transport logs and questioning why the bodies had been sent to Morrison Family Funeral Home instead of the county morgue. Janet's explanation that the funeral home had been specifically requested by the victims' families was supported by forged documentation that Vinnie Morrison's network had inserted into official files. The investigators found no evidence of irregularities in the executions themselves, which was exactly what the conspiracy had been designed to achieve. By following standard protocols while substituting specific medications, they had created a deception that was undetectable even under intense federal scrutiny. 3 months after Patterson's article was published, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued an unprecedented ruling. All 3 women were posthumously exonerated, with the court stating that overwhelming evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and systemic corruption has established beyond any doubt that Sarah Rodriguez, Elena Brooks, and Jasmine Williams were innocent of the crimes for which they were executed. The exonerations triggered a legal earthquake that extended far beyond the 3 individual cases. Hundreds of convictions obtained by corrupt prosecutors were reviewed and overturned. Judges who had been compromised by the corruption network were forced to resign or face impeachment. The entire structure of Pennsylvania's criminal justice system was subjected to federal oversight that would last for years. But for Catherine, Lisa, and Jessica, the exonerations were bittersweet victories that they could never publicly celebrate. They had achieved the vindication they had dreamed of during their years on death row, but they had to experience it as observers rather than participants. The posthumous exonerations also created practical complications for their new lives. Memorial services were planned for the 3 executed women, with victim advocacy groups using their cases as examples of why the death penalty should be abolished. The women found themselves in the surreal position of watching their own memorialization, while maintaining the secrecy that kept them alive. As the first anniversary of Patterson's article approached, each woman had learned to live with the complex emotions that came with being vindicated ghosts. They had achieved justice, but it was a justice they could never claim. They had exposed the truth, but it was a truth that required them to remain hidden forever. The gentle giant who had sacrificed his life to save them had given them more than survival. He had given them the chance to see their innocence established, and their tormentors held accountable. It wasn't the kind of vindication they had originally hoped for, but it was vindication nonetheless. The corruption network that had destroyed their original lives was crumbling, one arrest and resignation at a time. The system that had failed them was being reformed by federal oversight and public outrage. And somewhere in the country, 3 women who had been reborn from the ashes of injustice were building new lives that honored both the people they had been and the people they had become. The reckoning had begun, and justice delayed and transformed. But justice nonetheless was finally being served. 5 years after their executions, the 3 women who had once shared death row cells met, for the first time since their symbolic resurrection. The reunion took place in a cabin outside Asheville, North Carolina, arranged by Margaret Foster as a way to honor David Harrison's memory on what would have been his 47th birthday. Catherine Thompson arrived first, driving from her new home in Charleston, where she had relocated after establishing her graphic design business. The years had been kind to her. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had rebuilt her life from ashes and found peace in the process. Her auburn hair was now streaked with silver, and laugh lines had replaced the hollow-eyed desperation that had once defined her features. Dr. Lisa Martinez drove down from her practice in Asheville, where she had moved after Tom Bradley proposed, and she realized she couldn't marry someone who didn't know her true identity. The ending of that relationship had been painful but necessary, teaching Lisa that authentic happiness required more than safety and companionship. It required the possibility of genuine intimacy, even if that possibility remained forever out of reach. Jessica Walker flew in from Seattle, where she had taken a position as a curriculum specialist helping schools develop programs for trauma-affected children. Her work had evolved from teaching individual students to training teachers across the Pacific Northwest, multiplying her impact in ways that honored both her lost daughter and the children she now served. The three women sat on the cabin's porch as evening fell over the Blue Ridge Mountains, sharing stories of the lives they had built from the fragments David Harrison had saved. They looked like old friends reuniting after years apart, but their connection was deeper than friendship. They were survivors of an experience so unique that only they could truly understand its emotional complexity. "I dream about him sometimes," Catherine said, referring to David without needing to specify. "He's sitting in that ridiculous little chair in my cell, telling me that hope was worth fighting for even when it seemed impossible." Lisa nodded, understanding completely. "I think about what he gave up. Not just his life, but his chance to see whether any of it worked. He died not knowing if we would survive, if the plan would succeed, if his sacrifice would mean anything." Jessica's eyes filled with tears as she thought about the gentle giant who had seen past her conviction to the grieving mother beneath. "He believed in us when we couldn't believe in ourselves, even knowing what it would cost him." Margaret Foster joined them as the stars appeared overhead, carrying a bottle of wine and a manila folder that contained the final chapter of their story. At 62, Margaret had retired from prison social work to become an advocate for criminal justice reform, using her insider knowledge to push for changes that would prevent future injustices. "I have something to show you," Margaret said, opening the folder to reveal a letter written in David's careful handwriting. "I found this in his files when I was preparing materials for the David Harrison Foundation. He wrote it the night before he died." The letter was addressed simply to the three women who deserved better, and reading it felt like receiving a message from beyond death itself. "If you are reading this, then the impossible has happened. You are alive, you are free, and you have the chance to build the lives that were stolen from you. I hope you understand that your survival is not just a gift to yourselves, but to every person whose life you will touch in the years ahead. I know the weight of carrying false identities, of living with secrets that can never be shared. But I also know that you are stronger than the circumstances that tried to destroy you. You survived death row not just physically, but spiritually. You maintained your humanity in a place designed to strip it away. That strength will serve you well in whatever comes next. Please remember that you were never victims. You were warriors who fought impossible battles with courage that inspired everyone who knew your stories. The injustices you suffered were real, but they do not define who you are or limit who you can become. Use the lives you have been given to help others who face similar struggles. Not because you owe anything to anyone, but because you have knowledge and compassion that can make a difference. Your pain has been transformed into wisdom. Your survival has been transformed into hope. I am honored to have played a small part in your liberation. Live fully, love deeply, and never forget that you deserve every happiness this world can offer. With profound respect and affection, David Harrison." The women sat in silence for several minutes after Margaret finished reading, each processing the final words of the man who had sacrificed everything to give them a second chance at life. The letter felt like a benediction, a final blessing from someone who had seen their worth when the entire world had written them off as monsters. "He's right about using our experiences to help others," Catherine said finally. "But we've been doing that all along, haven't we? We just couldn't talk about why we understood so deeply what people were going through." Over the course of their reunion weekend, the three women shared the details of how they had transformed their survival into service. Catherine's graphic design work had evolved into a nonprofit organization that provided pro bono marketing services to victim advocacy groups and criminal justice reform organizations. Working under the umbrella of a larger agency, she had helped raise millions of dollars for causes that directly addressed the systemic problems that had destroyed their original lives. Lisa had become a leading advocate for medical ethics and patient safety, publishing research papers under Dr. Martinez's name that had influenced hospital policies across the country. Her work had led to new protocols for investigating unexplained patient deaths and had helped expose several cases of institutional cover-ups, similar to the one that had framed Elena Brooks. Jessica's curriculum development work had created educational programs, now used in thousands of schools, to help teachers identify and support children affected by domestic violence and trauma. Her materials had been translated into multiple languages and adapted for use in international settings, expanding her impact far beyond what she could have achieved as an individual teacher. David was right about our pain becoming wisdom, Lisa observed, but I don't think even he could have imagined how far that wisdom would reach. The reunion also served as an opportunity to address the practical realities of their ongoing situation. 5 years had passed since their executions, long enough for media attention to fade and investigations to conclude, but not long enough to eliminate all risks associated with their survival. Margaret provided updates on the key figures in their original cases. District Attorney William Morrison had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and had died of a heart attack during his second year of incarceration. Marcus Thompson had been killed in a prison fight, eliminating the one person who could have directly contradicted the official narrative of Jasmine's case. Most of the corrupt officials who had participated in their frame-ups were either dead, imprisoned, or living in disgrace. The network that destroyed your original lives has been completely dismantled, Margaret reported. But that doesn't mean discovery would be without consequences. You would face federal charges for faking your deaths, and everyone who helped. You would face prosecution for conspiracy. The women understood that their safety still depended on maintaining their false identities for the rest of their lives. They would never be able to reclaim their original names or publicly acknowledge their vindication. They would never be able to form relationships based on complete honesty about their pasts. They would never be able to visit the graves of family members who had mourned their deaths, but they had also learned that freedom wasn't just about what you could do, it was about what you chose to do with the possibilities available to you. Within the constraints of their necessary deception, they had built lives of meaning, purpose, and genuine happiness. I used to think that justice meant everyone knowing the truth about what happened to us, Jessica reflected. But maybe justice is more about what we've been able to accomplish since then. We've helped thousands of people who were facing the same kinds of injustices we survived. As their reunion weekend concluded, the 3 women made plans to meet annually on David's birthday, creating a tradition that would honor his memory while strengthening the bonds between them. They exchanged secure contact information that would allow them to communicate throughout the year while maintaining operational security. Standing in the cabin's driveway as they prepared to return to their separate lives, they shared an embrace that contained 5 years of gratitude, grief, and hard-won wisdom. They had been broken by circumstances beyond their control, but they had been healed by the love of a gentle giant who had seen their worth when no one else could. Catherine drove back to Charleston, thinking about the design project she was starting. The following week, a campaign for an organization that helped wrongfully convicted prisoners reintegrate into society. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using her freedom to help people achieve the kind of public vindication she could never claim. Lisa returned to her practice in Asheville with renewed commitment to the medical ethics work that had become her passion. She had recently been invited to testify before Congress about hospital corruption, an opportunity to influence policy at the national level while maintaining the anonymity that kept her safe. Jessica flew back to Seattle energized by plans for expanding her trauma education programs internationally. She had been contacted by organizations in refugee camps who wanted to adapt her materials for children affected by war and displacement, extending David's gift of hope to corners of the world where it was desperately needed. In the years that Followed, the three women continued to build on the foundation David Harrison had provided through his ultimate sacrifice. They remained connected to each other and to Margaret Foster, creating an informal network of support that honored the conspiracy that had saved them while protecting the secrets that kept them safe. Their annual reunions became opportunities, not just to remember the past, but to plan for futures that would maximize their impact on the world. They collaborated on projects when possible, shared resources and contacts, and provided each other with the kind of understanding that only fellow survivors could offer. By the 10th anniversary of their executions, the three women had influenced criminal justice policy at state and federal levels, helped thousands of trauma survivors heal and rebuild, and created educational programs that would protect future generations from the kinds of violence and institutional failure they had experienced. They had also learned to find joy in their constrained but meaningful lives. Catherine had developed close friendships with colleagues who appreciated her without knowing her history. Lisa had built a chosen family among her patients and community members who valued her compassion and skill. Jessica had mentored dozens of young teachers who carried forward her innovations in trauma-informed education. The gentle giant who had given his life to save theirs had created ripples that extended far beyond his original intention. David Harrison had wanted to save 3 innocent women from execution, but his sacrifice had ultimately saved thousands of people who had been helped by the wisdom and compassion those women had developed through their survival. Their story would never be publicly told in its entirety. The truth about their fake executions would remain hidden, protected by the loyalty of co-conspirators who understood that some secrets were worth keeping forever. But the impact of their survival would continue expanding, touching lives that would never know how their healing had been made possible by the courage of a man who had chosen love over fear, justice over safety, and hope over despair. In small towns and big cities across America, people were living better lives because 3 women had been given a second chance by someone who had seen their worth when the world had seen only their alleged crimes. Children were safer, patients were better protected, and victims of injustice had more advocates, because a gentle giant had refused to accept that some people were beyond saving. The broken women who had once shared death row had become healers themselves, transforming their pain into purpose and their survival into service. They had learned that sometimes the greatest victories were those that could never be publicly celebrated, and that the most profound love was that which asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to make a difference. David Harrison's legacy lived on in every life they touched, every injustice they helped prevent, every person who found hope because 3 women had refused to let their survival be wasted on bitterness or despair. The gentle giant had given them more than life. He had given them the chance to become the kind of people who made the world more just, more compassionate, and more worthy of the love he had shown them when they needed it most. Their resurrection had been temporary, but their redemption was eternal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.